I must admit, I never thought I'd be making a video about gaming on the Mac, but the new minis come in at a very compelling price point, so much so that I wondered whether or not this could be the lost Steam machine I always wanted. To not waste anyone's time, if you were hoping for a 4K gaming machine that plays AAA titles, I'm going to have to disappoint you. But at 1080p or even 4040p, it starts to get a little interesting. However, before anyone starts sharpening their pitchforks that I even conjured up such a thought, let me explain my reasoning behind it. If you don't care about that, there are chapter markers down below leading straight to your points of interest. For anyone remaining, thank you for saving the retention time on this video. I promise there's going to be at least one awful joke in here somewhere. Alright, so why would you want to do this in the first place? Apple isn't exactly known to be a player when it comes to gaming, right? Well, that's not entirely true, and yes, I am talking about mobile games, which is the largest chunk of the gaming industry, believe it or not. But more importantly, it's an area where Apple is successful, which is probably why they have started to broaden their ambitions. That and the fact that the gaming industry as a whole is now worth over $250 billion. This increasing interest from Apple is evident in a number of areas. For one, they started to mention gaming more and more in their keynote presentations, but more than just talk, they also launched a surprisingly compelling game service called Apple Arcade just a couple of years back. This lets you access a number of premium titles as long as you have an active subscription, kinda like Xbox Game Pass or PlayStation Plus, albeit in a much more simplified manner. Obviously this is focused on mobile gaming, but some of the titles are also playable on the desktop. They recently also launched something called Game Mode, again both on mobile and desktop, which prioritizes gaming relevant processes to boost the performance and reduce input latency. Lastly, but most relevant to this video, is probably Apple's Game Porting Toolkit, which was released in June 2023. This, in tandem with Rosetta that translates the x86 instructions into ARM-based ones, enables Windows games to run on macOS, but more on that particular topic later in the video. So Apple isn't all talk, but to name them among Sony, Microsoft and Nintendo definitely doesn't feel right, but you probably already knew that, so what am I getting at here? Well, with all these steady advances that Apple has made over the years towards gaming, I thought maybe, just maybe, the new base model Mac Mini has enough ingredients to be Apple's first unintentional gaming product. To further support my thesis, I want to put up two guardrails. The first one concerns what everyone is already raving about, and that is the entry price for one, if not the cheapest Mac computer that has ever been released. Yes, the 250GB of storage is a hard pill to swallow, especially if you consider that certain titles like Baldur's Gate 3 will need over 140GB. But it also appears that you can, in a very un-Apple-ish way, expand that storage, even if it's still a proprietary interface, or you can just hook up a fast enough external SSD and call it a day. That makes the $599 box pretty compelling, but it also enters the price range of current generation gaming consoles, actually surpassing them at this point apart from the recently launched PS5 Pro of course. Which brings me to the second guardrail, comparing the Mac Mini to said gaming consoles. Now I know how this might sound, but please indulge my brainless thought for a second. The new Mini isn't going to reach PS5 or Series X levels of performance anytime soon, no matter how well optimized some of the games are. But depending on how picky you are, it doesn't have to. The TV, or to be more precise, the distance to the TV, hides a lot of the visual shortcomings, thus giving you the impression of better visuals than what they actually are. I know this is a very biased way to look at this, and I'm leaning heavily out of the window here, while being on a moving train. But with this handicap, I generally thought the Mini might be able to pull punches above its weight class. But as the intro already spoiled it, it lost this match, but occasionally it did land a punch, and those punches? They were critical hits. First, we have to figure out how to get the games running, and here we have a couple of options. I won't be covering every game launcher, that would probably kill me, and even though you might wish for that to happen by the end of this video, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told my neighbor's cat. Not today. Instead, I will focus mostly on Steam, simply because most of my games are in that library and because it is also the only client that has a big picture mode. Meaning it's perfect to navigate on a larger display using a controller and therefore closer to that console experience we strive for. If you didn't know, this is the same UI that is running on the Steam Deck and was originally conceived for this exact purpose, couch gaming. It also runs fantastically well and natively on macOS, which unfortunately cannot be said about most of the games. Reason being that those are Windows games and you can't just install Windows games on a Mac and expect them to run. Well, actually you can, but we'll get to those in a minute. Before, let's look at games that have a native Mac port, which I had a few in my library, such as Baldur's Gate 3, which I was particularly interested in trying out as it is one of the more high-profile games in recent memory. Unfortunately, it couldn't reach a balance between performance and visuals I could stomach. At 1080p with low settings, you're going to hover around 30 FPS, and it's not going to be pretty 30 FPS. Even with the TV's distance, you can still spot a lot of visual imperfections, but worst of all is the constantly dropping frame rate. I want to take this moment and add a little disclaimer. Almost all the games I'm going to show you today are games that I'm currently not playing, or actually never played. It's the so-called Steam paradox, where you keep buying games during a sale and then end up never touching them because something new and shiny came along in the meantime. If you're wondering why I'm not showing you games that I am playing, well, it's because I couldn't get any of those to run at all. But again, more on those funky Windows versions later. Because of that, I'm for the most part restrained to the opening acts in these games. This means the performance I captured doesn't paint a full picture, like in Baldur's Gate 3 again, where I read that in later parts the game will get very demanding, so the already bad performance is going to get worse. To give you an additional performance example, let's up the resolution to 4K in order to get closer to the one from the PS5 version and get a side-by-side view. As you can see, the frame rate drops below 20 FPS, but I will admit, in the cutscenes the visuals come shockingly close to the PS5 variant, but are also shockingly choppy. I then fired up Tunic, a lovely Zelda-inspired adventure game from 2022, hoping that something with simpler graphics would run a lot better. At 1440p with high settings, this pretty little title actually fulfills my hopes. By the way, don't let the 5K resolution in the overlay confuse you. I recorded this on my 5K Apple Studio displays, and if you play certain titles at 1440p, it'll automatically use double the pixels. Which in the TV environment I am basing this test on doesn't really matter, but it's an interesting footnote nonetheless. Other games in my library didn't perform as well, like Frostpunk, which is a bit older but still struggled to remain at 30 FPS. Civilization 6 fared much better, but this might not be the best example to show off the hardware power of a new machine, and again, the tutorial probably isn't a good representation either. Apple did show off Civilization 7 in their recent keynote though, so maybe that will be a visually more appealing title to look forward to. I left most of my other titles in the closet as I didn't think those would make a good example for what I was trying to do here, but rest assured there are more Mac native games on Steam, a surprisingly large amount I must say. But I think it's time to divorce ourselves from the native list and try alternative routes. I have to get a tiny little bit technical for the next bit, but don't worry, my peanut-sized brain won't allow much, so it shouldn't get too complex. Apple's computers run on ARM-based chips, which is very different from the x86 architecture that most Windows machines use. Think of it like Windows and macOS games being raised in different countries and therefore talking the language of their respective country. So running those games in a foreign environment is like talking English while being abroad in Japan. But luckily, there are a lot of smart people on this planet that create systems and services to automatically take care of such translations. One of these is Whiskey, not the drink, but the game porting application, although the liquid variant might be helpful too in certain situations, like trying to make it through this video. Quality jokes aside, Whiskey uses Apple's game porting toolkit, which is a set of developer tools designed to help bring Windows games over to macOS by translating their API calls, like the ones from DirectX, into Metal. Not the material, but Apple's version of DirectX. Together with Rosetta, which translates the x86 instructions into ARM-based ones, they sort of form a Google Translate for games. And for all the developers who are now getting furious at me for oversimplifying this, may I offer some liquid whiskey? In the end, this means we can run a lot more games, Windows games on Apple's M-series hardware, which is super cool. The installation is also surprisingly easy. You can basically install the entire Windows Steam client and then just continue downloading your games like you're used to. You can even use external hard drives, which I needed to due to the minuscule 250 GB of space on my unit. But more importantly, how did the games perform? Okay, Tales of Arise isn't known to be a very demanding title, but it struggled to stay around 40 FPS in 1080p, even on the lowest setting. Grand Blue Fantasy Relink fared even worse. Here I couldn't even get past the start menu as it ran at what seemed to be half a frame per second, if not less. Google and Reddit is going to be your best friend here at trying to figure out what to do, and the popularity of the game will also greatly increase your chances of success. There are also sites like ProtonDB for Linux gaming, such as applegamingwiki.com, that will tell you beforehand if your title in question runs and how well it runs. I must admit, the entire experience reminded me of Linux gaming just a couple of years ago, where Valve gave Proton a big push because the Steam Deck is running Linux. So here's hoping that the increased interest of Apple is going to do the same for macOS gaming. But back to Whiskey. Apart from the titles I wanted to play, the rest seemed to work pretty well, like Cyberpunk 2077. However, I had to keep the resolution to 1080p, anything above that was pointless, and with the lowest setting, the benchmark averaged only around 22 FPS. Even with AMD's fidelity settings set to performance, the increase wasn't enough to make it any better. For my personal preferences, this is too low. Even 30 FPS these days is a barrier that seems unnecessary if you have other more capable devices. However, it is still very impressive that it ran at all, and I'd say the visuals on low paired with the 1080p resolution isn't as bad as compared to Baldur's Gate 3. Maybe the official port of Cyberpunk 2077 will fare better, which was recently announced alongside Apple's M4 MacBook Pro, but that version will likely be walled into the one area I dread the most when it comes to gaming: the App Store. The games you're going to find in Apple's App Store aren't necessarily better than those found in other stores, but at least for the two titles that I picked, I was surprised at how much better they ran compared to the rest I tried up until now. Of course, since I am not comparing the same titles, this entire statement has no ground. But I do believe that when Apple includes a game within its own App Store, they at least make sure that it runs somewhat well. 4K gaming is still an impossibility here, but the Resident Evil 4 remake at 1080p is playable and looks surprisingly good at medium to high settings using Apple's Metal FX in performance mode. We're still dealing with a frame rate below 60, but the gameplay feels rather smooth, and although raising the resolution to 1440p takes a significant hit, it's still somewhat playable. However, this depends on your threshold of acceptable performance, of course. Death Stranding ran even better. Here I was able to keep the 1440p resolution, but again, there were drops, but never below 30, at least in the earlier parts of the game. I don't know what happens once it starts raining babies.
Makes me feel like shit every time.
Comparing this to the PS5 version still shows a significant loss in detail though, even though I am using the high settings and Apple's Metal FX on balanced mode. The recording you see here is also of the non-HDR version, as I don't have a device capable to capture that type of signal. And HDR on macOS looks just weird. Death Stranding especially had this oversaturated image on my TV that made it look a lot less appealing. However, overall I was still very impressed with the capabilities of the Mini. It's a little crazy that a device with a footprint smaller than that of an Xbox Series X can even output visuals like this and remain shockingly silent on top of it. But when it comes down to it, there are still too many factors that make this experience feel a bit experimental. This, however, heavily depends on the type of games you have in mind. Smaller indie titles seem to run perfectly fine and are also much more available. If we take the Mini's intended use as an affordable desktop computer, those types of games make much more sense, as they fit perfectly into the target demographic. That's not to say that bigger games will never come. As mentioned, Cyberpunk is already on its way, but not only that, Control and the new Assassin's Creed Shadows were announced as well. But regardless of how good those ports will be, none of those will run great on the base model anyway. For higher spec Macs, such as those with an M4 Pro and Max, or even the yet to be announced but inevitable M4 Ultra, those could yield surprisingly great results. That defeats the allure of the $599 entry price though. It just means a $2,000 to $3,000 system from Apple can also run modern games, and run them well, I assume. I don't know yet, of course, this is just hopeful speculation. For now, I think the Mini remains powerful, but more in its intended purpose, rather than the accidental gaming machine I was hoping for. There are better options out there if you're looking for a way to play games on a TV though. Even within Apple, there's a better option in the form of the Apple TV, if simpler graphics are enough. The same goes for emulation. It is very capable and played my Dreamcast titles perfectly fine, but if this is your goal, again, there are much better and cheaper alternatives out there. I'd recommend you check out Retro Game Corps or ETA Prime, both great channels that cover those type of devices in much more detail. Mac gaming is on the rise though, and if you want to learn more about that, I'd like to point you towards one last channel, Mr. Mac Right. He's got much more detailed performance insights into some of the games I showed you today and many more. I've left the links to his channel as well as the others down in the description below. For now, I want to raise a glass to you for making it to the end of the video. So thank you. There's one more before the year draws to an end, so stay tuned. Thank you again so much for watching, cheers, and see you again in the next one.